resume.
Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner and panel. My name is Judah Harrison, and I'm with the Conservation Coalition, which is a group of 6 non-governmental organizations and 1 individual. Mr. Lund, can you bring up Exhibit 976, please? Dr. McDonald, this morning we were speaking, or you were speaking about this email to various council. I wanted to specifically focus on the last line of the 3rd paragraph, where it reads that there is a pretty large gaps. Well, there are pretty large gaps between what Environment Canada is prepared to do and what DFO is prepared to do, and this gap is largest in the marine environment. I take it that you did not write this email, but you are familiar with it. Is that correct?
I did not write it. I am familiar with it by virtue of this process.
Thank you. Now, could you, in as succinct a manner as possible, explain what those gaps are? Give us specific gaps that are not being regulated by either Environment Canada or DFO.
Well, I think it's along the lines of what we've been discussing so far. That is, DFO is not doing any more toxic pathway source sink work in the marine environment, nor really monitoring the marine environment. And Environment Canada is not doing that either.
Is there any other regulatory gaps that you can think of where neither ministry is effectively regulating contaminants?
I'm not thinking of something in particular. As I understand how the system works with transfers, Environment Canada was really strongly the regulator in this system, and DFO was a partner in that. But under SEPA, certainly Environment Canada had the lead on providing regulations.
Okay, thank you. And in the same document, this morning we heard that you were listed as among the subversive elements at work here. Is that correct?
Well, I don't know. I didn't write that memo, and it was referred to very vaguely, but I would consider myself to be working on some of these issues to complete them, if nothing else, when they were not a departmental priority anymore.
So just to be clear, you were, in your understanding, you were called subversive for completing research, even though departmental priorities had moved on.
Yeah, that's my take on it. I was continuing to do research or finish research on pathways when the department said we've moved on.
Thank you. And Mr. Lunn, do you mind bringing up document 9 from Commission Council's list, please? I just spoke with Council for Canada, who informed me that this may already be an exhibit, Exhibit 742. But I will stick with you, Mr. McDonald. This is an email from Dr. Peter Ross, who, with respect to PBDEs, and I actually don't know what that acronym stands for, but I heard you say it this morning. So, and there's 3 types of PBDEs, one of which was not banned, that being DECA. And then, after a series of letters and pressure from scientists, the DECA was actually banned. Is my understanding correct?
Firstly, PBDEs are polybrominated diphenyl ethers. There are 209 of them. They're basically brominated ring compounds. Our Environment Canada was deciding on how to regulate these, what to ban. And at the time, it appeared that they were going to ban most of the PBDEs, but they were going to leave 209 off. And 209 is the heaviest one, and it was used, I believe, still in the computer industry as a fireproofer. Our research, and most of this research goes back for a number of years. It came from a basis of research that we've been doing over all those years. So we felt within DFO we had the science understanding of the risks from these, and we wanted for DFO to pass the message to Environment Canada in a formal note of what their take was on this. And at that time, it looked like Environment Canada was going to leave DECA as still in use. And we felt that was ill-advised from the science point of view, and we wanted to get that message across. So we did that. At the end of the day, Environment Canada also came down on 209 and banned it. They may have done it because of what we did, but there's not a connected line there.
Just for my own ignorance, can you, the DO 209 and DECA, are they the same thing, or each is a different type of the 209 PBDEs?
They're the same thing.
They're the same thing, thank you. And taking a bit of a step back, we hear often, including at this commission, that the precautionary principle guides decision-making at DFO, Environment Canada, and Canada in general. Now, in my view, if you read this, the way that these chemicals were banned, it would not be in a precautionary manner. It would actually be the opposite. It would be that not until proof is brought do we actually say that certain chemicals are not allowed to be used. And my question to you first, Dr. McDonald, is can you please explain how the precautionary principle guides your work today?
I should clarify a little bit. There's two components of this. There's the precautionary principle, which throws the onus entirely on the proposed user of something to demonstrate no harm. And then there's another thing called the precautionary approach, which I think is quite a bit softer than that. If you follow the precautionary principle, you probably would do nothing. You could justify doing nothing. So it's a position that is attractive, but probably not doable. So what we've tended to do is not necessarily use that principle directly, but rather try to look at what we felt were the bigger risks in the system and find a way of taking those ones out. Unfortunately, there are 25,000 or more chemicals that we've got out in circulation, and we can't do something on every one of them. Money forbids it. On the other hand, a lot of these chemicals have uses in society that are have another function. For example, pharmaceuticals. So to just say we stop using them is also not on the table. So it kind of leaves us in a bit of a difficulty in that we can't actually execute the precautionary principle, even though we might like to. So what we've tried to do is to use that approach, if you like, to identify the ones that we think have latent risks, and PBDEs are one of those, and get those curtailed. We know something about PBDEs and the risks they present us because we've been through a long experience with PCBs, and we know exactly what happened there and how long it's taking for them to turn down.
Now, following up on that, is there currently a suite of chemicals that would be defined as toxic within the Canadian Environmental Protection Act that are nonetheless permissible to use in Canada today?
I'm sure there are.
Dr. McDonald, you also this morning you were talking about sublethal impacts of chemicals, and then you alluded to the fact that cumulative or bioaccumulation of non-lethal chemical contamination would be just as dangerous as a single source lethal contamination. Well, maybe not just as dangerous because the lethal source would kill the fish. But my question to you is there specific toxics right now in the Fraser environment that you think or suspect are harming Fraser sockeye? And if so, and are nonetheless permissible for use?
I worry about some, but I haven't got evidence to show what the harm is. Paracelsus many years ago said with toxicity, it's all in the dose. Everything is toxic if you have enough dose. Water is toxic with enough dose. So our task here is to do several things. One is to identify those compounds that have a definite toxicity and we understand it, and then to look in the environment and ask the question of whether thresholds of toxicity are being passed. And we certainly don't have the science together for many compounds in that context.
You said something very interesting, and you said there's some that you suspect are harmful, but you have no evidence of what harm there is. Now, from what I stand, the precautionary principle demands that in such case, you do not allow this chemical to be used until it's proven to not be harmful. But in my view, Canada consistently regulates in the opposite direction. And until independent science has proved harm, it's allowable. Is that fair in your view?
I think it needs more context than that. I think that you have to weigh risks and benefits of things. I think there are substances and things that we are doing in Canada that would qualify under that, one of which would be putting CO2 in the atmosphere. We continue to do it because the choice of not doing it might have more severe consequences than the choice of continuing it. These decisions, scientists try to put together a component of the system. They try to advise on what the risks are and who is at risk and why in the case of all of these chemicals. That information gets fed into a policy somewhere, and that policy is produced by people, not scientists, who consider many other aspects. So I don't think it's surprising that sometimes the advice that we would give or the desire that we would have to have all these chemicals disappear from aquatic systems isn't followed.
And I agree with you, but I mean, my point was that we say we're guided by a precautionary approach, but in action we never are. And so my next question is, in your 25 years experience, can you think of any chemicals that have been banned precautionarily without proof of harm?
Nothing is coming to mind in particular. I can't think of things that were screened out. Certainly we have screened things out when we found that they caused harm. And generally, the ones we worry about are what we would call persistent bioaccumulative toxic chemicals that, and of those three words, the one that rings the bell the most is persistent. And I would like to give one example to illustrate how difficult this sometimes is. One of the chemicals that's been made in society, a very useful one, are the refrigerants, the freons, CFCs we call them. These have been shown to be among the least toxic chemicals ever made. You can breathe them in, you can drink them, they will not harm you. And yet, they were delivered to us as being basically inert. Well, inert sounds very good, but when you turn that inert over, it actually says it's persistent, and persistent brings up an alarm bell. Ultimately, through the science, we discovered that CFCs went up into the stratosphere and they damaged chemistry up there, damaged ozone production, and that causes UV penetration. Well, so those chemicals clearly would not have been put out under a precautionary principle had we known what their mode of action was. But we don't have all that knowledge. So sometimes things are used in the context that they appear very safe and everything we know about them is okay.
And I guess what I'm suggesting is sometimes we know that there's harms, or we suspect highly that there's harms, yet we still approve them anyways. And I would say that that's a much more common occurrence than what you just discussed. Is that fair?
That's probably true. I don't keep up with all of the ins and outs of that.
Okay. This morning you also talked about the role of government scientists, and from what I took from what you said the role of a government scientist to provide sound advice, and then to let the government decision maker decide, to use that basis to then make the political decision. Is that fair?
I think it is.
And my question is, has there been, in your experience, has there been a shift in your 25 years at the department where early on, including where the Fisheries Research Board existed, that this was that the scientists would only provide advice or sound science? And is it your experience that in the last number of years there's been a new role that's been requested of science? Or do you still see as the primary actual role being played as providing objective sound advice?
I still see that as our primary role.
My last line of questioning is just about some specific chemicals, and these are chemicals used in the aquaculture industry. I'd like to know if either of you have any familiar about the chemical slice in particular.
Should I answer that?
Sure.
I have some familiarity with it. We have,
I'm sorry, Shane Hopkins for the BC Salmon Farmers Association. I was just wondering if this is a panel on freshwater urbanization, and if this chemical that you're now asking about was in fact in the witness panel summaries. I don't believe that we've had a notice of this, and we have concerns about discussing the aquaculture industry in a panel on freshwater.
And in my view, this is a panel on pesticides. I'm asking about a specific pesticide, clearly relevant to the terms of this panel. I will not get into very much specifics. I just want to talk from a regulatory place. Mr. Commissioner?
I think in fairness, Mr. Harrison, I'm not sure where you're going with this, so it's difficult for me to assess the objection. I don't know if it's necessarily an objection. It's really a question of whether or not the parties have had notice that you are going to pursue this specific line of questioning. And if not, if they did, they might have had questions themselves pertaining to this. So I'm not exactly sure where you're going with it.
In response, I say two things. First of all, nobody gives anybody notice of lines of questioning that they're going to give, except we do have documents.
Yes.
And I apologize if that. What I was going to is about the regulatory approval of specific pesticides that are used widely in BC and have impact on Fraser's sockeye. So the approval process is all I'm sticking to.
All right. Well, I think if you want to go with the approval process, that's fine. It may or may not include this particular chemical that you've just spoken about. But if that's where you're going, I think in a general sense, that would be appropriate.
Okay, thank you. I'll keep it very general.
Mr. Commissioner, just for the record, I will object if he asks about slice, which is not used in fresh water. Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, if I may, it's Brenda Gertner for the First Nation Coalition. We've heard quite a bit from this panel about the marine environment and not very much information about the marine environment. If he has some information about the marine environment, as general as it may be, I think it might be useful for us to hear it.
I don't disagree, Ms. Gardner. I just don't know where this line of questioning is going to go and whether these witnesses were prepared to answer such questions and whether all of the participants have had notice that it may be going in that particular direction. So I leave it with Ms. Baker because this evidence has now been introduced, and in terms of the scope of the evidence, I think it should fall within the parameters of the documents we have before us for these witnesses, and the range of questions should stick to those documents. So I'm not sure where Mr. Harrison's going or whether Ms. Baker has any concern about that.
Well, no, you've made your ruling that he can ask general questions, and so I'm content for that to continue. I mean, it depends on how far he gets into it, I suppose.
Okay, I will proceed very carefully, and I will look up and stay general. This question is for you, Dr. Talbot. Is my understanding that Environment Canada regulates toxics generally? Is that correct?
Yeah, generally. Through the Canadian Environmental Protection Act.
Does Environment Canada regulate chemicals, including pesticides, that are used on marine finfish farms?
No, we don't regulate pesticides. We don't have authority over pesticides. So it'd be the Pesticide Management Regulatory Agency.
So, thank you. And do you, does Environment Canada regulate any chemicals that are used on marine fish farms?
We, it's difficult to answer that specifically because it's an open-ended question. It would depend on which chemicals might be used under circumstances. You know, it could be as benign as salt, you know, or as complex as some other products that might be used that would be covered under the SEPA. So the potential is there if it's a substance that's declared toxic under SEPA, but to my knowledge, there are none at this point.
Is there any part of Environment Canada that sees oversight of the aquaculture industry and the chemicals they use that specifically sees that as their mandate?
No, there is not.
And Dr. McDonald, do you know if there's any in DFO that sees that as their mandate?
No, I don't.
Okay. Those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Commissioner. Crystal Reeves for the First Nations Coalition, and with me, Brenda Gertner. The First Nations Coalition for the Witnesses is a group of First Nations, including the First Nations Fisheries Council, tribes up and down the Fraser River, up to Prince George, as well as some Douglas Treaty Nations, and as well as the Haida Nation. So my first set of questions is directed towards you, Dr. McDonald. And this morning, you talked about the loss and rollback of funding that was part of the ESSRE program, RF program. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then you said that under the new regime, scientists were expected to go out and find funding from other sources as part of going into toxic research.
That's correct.
And so since that time then, how successful would you say, in your opinion, have DFO scientists been in finding those other funds in other programs?
Not too bad. We have found people interested in the question of toxic chemicals from collaborations with Korea to the SARA. So there have been funds that we've gotten.
And would some of those funds have been directed towards Fraser River sockeye, or would they have been more general?
They would have been more general.
Right. In terms of comparison, I'm not sure if you'll know this, but what would you say generally would be the amount of funding you had under the old regime versus what people are gathering through various funding sources now, comparatively in terms of amounts?
I don't really have a figure for that to give you. I could find such out, but I don't have it here.
Okay, perhaps we could have Commission Counsel find something like that. Okay, moving on to Commission tab 16. And this was a presentation done in 2005, and it was a DFO toxic chemical review follow-up. Are you aware of this workshop review that was done?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And I'd like to take you to page 19 now of the document. And on page 19, it just talks about the state of knowledge, and this was one of the core areas that needed to be worked on going forward after 2005, according to the earlier parts of the review documents, which I won't take you into. And it outlines a number of areas, I guess, of studies that were either currently being done or needed to be done, impacts of classes of toxics on fisheries resources, trace elements, pesticides, impacts of mixtures on fisheries resources, sentinel species for impact studies, and the like. Since 2005, what studies have been done on these various areas to your knowledge?
There have been some. Most of the studies that have been done are listed under publications by Peter Ross and colleagues. I'm involved in some of those. He is our main toxicological scientist in my section.
And are any of the studies related to Fraser River sockeye specifically?
I have been involved in looking at the sockeye as a transport pathway, bringing contaminants into lakes. That was more looking at how they focus these contaminants into their life cycle and not on the toxicity itself.
And what year was that research done, or is this an ongoing?
It started in about 1999 or 2000. It continued on for a few years, partly under ESSRF funds and partly under university sequestered funds and students.
Right. Okay, and so, but then since then, you haven't done anything further since the rollback of the funding?
Personally, I have done nothing. I'm not a toxicologist, so I don't do that kind of work. But Peter Ross has done some work related to toxic chemicals, some of it to do with killer whales, and not so much on sockeye, though, I don't think. He's got some sockeye papers.
Okay, thank you. According to the PPR, and I won't take you there just sort of in the interest of time, but of course it talks about that DFO is responsible for providing various forms of technical advice to Environment Canada, such as providing fisheries resource and fish habitat experience, recommending receiving water quality criteria, the effects of toxicology and effects of pollutants on specific biological process. So I guess if the science program related to toxic chemicals has been cut back from 2004, and there's, other than Peter Ross, not much research being done, and there's even a question of whether he's doing research on Fraser River sockeye. I guess my question is, what is the level of advice that DFO Science can give to Environment Canada if there's been such cutbacks and no such science is being done?
Well, it would be minimal. It would be based on our opinion on these fish and on where we know them to be and what the risks are. There was a paper written, and I believe it's been entered in here somewhere, between Peter Ross and myself talking about contaminants in fish specifically, but a lot of it is based on analogy, really, and not on direct research on the fish.
If Environment Canada is getting advice from DFO, then the advice they're getting is analogous advice, and that's what they're depending on to move forward with their processes on regulation and such.
I think that would be true.
Dr. Talbot, do you have anything that you wanted to add to that question of DFO science advice going to Environment Canada, and how that lack of science, I guess, in a term, impacts upon your decision making?
Perhaps the only thing to add is that Environment Canada, the risk assessors generally look at the body of knowledge comprehensively and worldwide on substances that it's studying for determination as toxic under SEPA, and it'll look at all the information available, and it doesn't necessarily exclude or include information that would be generated on a specific fish, such as Pacific salmon. So the information that's generated that's in a broad context on contaminants is used by Environment Canada.
Right, but not specific to Fraser River sockeye?
No, it does not have to be, no.
Back to you, Dr. McDonald. You've been talking about research that's done on pathways and then research on toxicity to fish, and those sort of being the two different, I guess, envelopes of study or ways of study. And would you agree with that? That's the two sort of envelopes of study, or?
You could categorize it that way.
Okay, and we've heard that DFO is taking an ecosystem-based approach to the management of Fraser River sockeye. Would you agree with that?
It's partly true, maybe partly not true.
I guess my question is, if DFO is going to take ecosystem-based management seriously, and we've sort of heard at the commission here prior to this that they are moving in that direction or wanting to move in that direction, I guess my question is, wouldn't science advice, if you're going to take an ecosystem-based approach, want to include all variables within the ecosystem, including pathways and including toxicity to fish?
I would agree with that.
And so then perhaps pathway research needs to be included going forward if we're going to understand sustainability of Fraser River sockeye in the long term.
I would agree with that.
I guess I'd need to mark tab 16 as the next exhibit.
Exhibit 982.
This morning, Canada took you to a document, and that's now Exhibit 981. And if we could just pull that up, Registrar. And I'd like to go to page 10 of that document. Can you just scroll down? Actually, perhaps it's the next page there. Sorry, page 9, sorry. Yeah, sorry, it's page 9. And the third bullet down, It says new directions, focus on solving practical problems that are essential to DFO's mandate obligations and the needs of clients. Dr. McDonald, in your opinion, who are DFO's clients as it relates to toxicity research of Fraser River sockeye in particular?
Well, historically, DFO has had a history of, or at least I've been in a system where I've asked that question myself, and the answer I've gotten is it's people like fishing industry, it's special interest groups, I suppose, would be a client, anybody who needs this advice. One of our clients would be the science community. One client that appeared not to be our client, and I asked this question very pointedly for the reason, was the fish themselves. Now, anybody who gave us funding, in other words, if we got funding from some group or some other group, they de facto became a client as well, because of course they funded us to do some research, and we did that research.
Right, and would you consider First Nations then a client of DFO in terms of toxicity research?
I would consider them a client, yes.
And why? Why would you consider them a client?
Because amongst the peoples of Canada, First Nations have the highest exposure generally to aquatic resources. They have traditionally come, coastal peoples, from eating a lot of fish. And I use fish generically, clams, fish, seals in the Arctic, beluga. So they tend to be very high in their diet in aquatic items. By virtue of where they eat in the food web, they place themselves at a fairly high trophic level. That is, they're not unlike bears if you think about the diet, because they're eating fish and they're eating whales and seals. So when we worry about bioaccumulating, biomagnifying contaminants, through the food web is the major path of exposure, and that means Native peoples would be the target of that exposure. Furthermore, they're always interested in maintaining an ecosystem that allows them to continue their traditional hunting and gathering. And if these chemicals are harming those systems, then they can't do that.
I'd like to pull up Exhibit 836 of which is a document that's been entered previously in the Commission by us. And this is known as the Siska Society Report, Siska Salmon and Indigenous Peoples' Life Work. Are you familiar with this document, Dr. McDonald?
No, I'm not.
Okay, well, just for a brief overview, the Siska Society worked with a variety of First Nations to look at contaminants in the Fraser River and the Thompson River in Fraser River sockeye. And perhaps we can just go to page 47 of this document. And if you just want to blow up the, I believe it's, yeah, the top part there. And this part here, they discuss an increase in the application of creosote in the Fraser River and Thompson River watersheds. And are you aware of any current or, say, studies in the past 5 or 6 years that have been done either by DFO or Environment Canada on creosote?
In the past 5 or 6 years, not specifically, no.
And Dr. Talbot, are you aware of any?
No, I'm not. Only through general reading, but not through our mandate.
Right. And then if we could go to page 53 of this document. And just blow up the top part again. And here they are talking about the use of release TM in the Fraser Basin, which from the report they talk about how it's used in the forest industry to kill broadleaf trees. And are either of you aware of studies done on the impacts or levels of release TM, either by Environment Canada or DFO?
Could you clarify what TM is?
Release TM, if you just want to blow that up a little bit more, well, apparently that's the commercialized name of the chemical that they talk about in the report, and they don't have the listing, so that's all I know it by. But anyways, regardless of which, I guess you don't know what Release TM refers to.
I don't.
Do you, Dr. Talbot?
No, I don't. You're talking about a defoliant? Is that?
Yeah, from my understanding is it removes the leaves off broadleaf trees, which I guess is sort of considered a tree that impacts upon the growth of the forest. That's my understanding from the report.
Yeah, I don't know it's my purpose to ask
Okay, well,
questions,
I'll just,
but
yeah.
There's 2,4-D that was used.
Right. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that throughout this report, they go through a variety of chemicals that are of concern to them as First Nations. And given what you've said, Dr. McDonald, about, I guess, the biocumulative effects for First Nations in eating a lot of Fraser River sockeye and other forms of salmon, I guess the point of this is that in terms of science isn't just, you'd agree that science isn't just an abstract study, but we're talking about human health and impacts on systems and communities.
Yes, I would say I would like it not to be an abstract study. It would have an effect of informing us and allowing us to make decisions.
And I guess if First Nations are identifying particular chemicals or particular toxic chemicals that they view or they're seeing, in particular the study where they did testing, appearing in their environment and appearing in the fish, then if they're a client of DFO, should that generate some movement in the science that's generated?
Yes, I think it would, or should. I should add that an issue like that, we have governmental mandates, and DFO has a mandate for the fish, but it's not the same mandate as Health Canada, so it's not our mandate to worry about the human health aspects, although we might partner with Health Canada people.
Right, and is such partnering done right now?
It is.
Okay, thank you. Again to you, Dr. McDonald. According to your CV, you conducted core sampling of Shuswap Lake in 2002, is that correct?
That's correct.
And can you just briefly describe what you found in those core samples?
Wow, you're going back a ways, and I've collected a lot of core samples. What we look for in those are records of contaminants, and certainly we found them. As we find in almost all inventories in the environment these days, and there are modern components in there. As I recall, we saw PCBs in those lakes specifically, and we probably saw DDT as well, and we would have seen that as a peak around the early 1960s when we were using it as an aerial forest spray.
Right. And did your core sampling look at some of the new and emerging chemicals, I guess what we've been talking about here at the Commission, the PBDEs and the like?
No, we did not look at PBDEs because they hadn't really emerged with great excitement. There are some other new age chemicals that we are trying to look at now. We didn't look at them then for a couple of reasons. One is that we didn't have the techniques to do it. And the other is that some of these chemicals don't leave much of a trace or don't leave a record in sediments.
And do you know if this research has been, made widely available to others that you did in the Shuswap Lake?
We've published this work in 2 or 3 journal articles, peer-reviewed journal articles. Certainly my manager, Robin Brown, asks to have these papers, and I give them to him, so they have gotten into management in one way, shape, or form.
I guess the reason I'm asking that question is at Commission's tab 25, and maybe we can just briefly go there. And at page 48, and if you just go to the 3rd paragraph from the bottom. And this paper was done for the Fraser Basin Council, and it was the done by consultants, and it's looking at the water quality in the Shuswap lakes, and it's a monitoring plan. And in this paragraph there, it says the degree to which emerging contaminants are present in Shuswap Lake and Mare Lake is unknown due to limited monitoring budgets and traditional scope of regional water quality monitoring programs. Based on surveys from other large lakes in Western Europe, it is likely that some emerging contaminants are already present in Shuswap and Mare Lakes, although the concentrations are quite low and ecological implications uncertain. And I just was wondering whether your study that you would have done would have addressed any of perhaps some of the issues they're talking about here at all.
It would have, I think, set a comparative record for some contaminants like PCBs and DDT, because we've done those in quite a few lakes, including the BC Fraser Basin and including Alaska. So we would be able to do a comparison and say whether Shuswap was worse or better. But as asked in the previous question, we certainly haven't done all the contaminants, and I don't think we could say a thing about PBDEs. I could give you an example. In one of our lakes, Nicola Lake, we found a very large hit of DDT coming in the 1980s, well after DDT had been banned for use in Canada. It also, following that study, Environment Canada had a look at the fish, and they found high DDT in them as well. And we discovered an illicit use of DDT in that lake at that time. So the sediment cores often tell us if something's awry. I don't recall Shuswap Lake being particularly different from other lakes in that context.
Right. Okay, maybe we'll move on. I guess I'd like to mark that paper, tab 25, as the next exhibit.
Exhibit 983.
Thank you. Moving on to Commission tab 20. And this was a memo to Claire Dansereau, and what it is it's outlining enforcement and administration of pollution prevention provisions under the Fisheries Act and its opinion. And if you just go to page, the next page of the document, and within the summary there, the second bullet point, and it's talking, I guess, about the pollution prevention provisions have historically been administered and enforced by Environment Canada, and it's talking about this whole lack of, I guess, there's gaps in the lack of understanding. And one of the options at bullet point 2 says a number of emerging Section 36 issues have highlighted the need to address the situation, including a report from the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development. And then at bullet point 3, options have been examined, and it is recommended that the department, here they're talking about DFO, pursue a position of having Environment Canada fully administering and accountable for Section 36 of the Fisheries Act, including new regulations related to aquaculture, aquatic invasive species, and other emerging issues.
Mr. Commissioner, it's Mark East from Government of Canada. I would suggest perhaps that Council ask Dr. McDonald if he has any familiarity with this briefing note and the material within it.
Actually, my questions were actually towards Dr. Talbot. Are you aware of this change, proposed change?
And I think the objection would still apply if it was a question directed to Dr. Talbot.
Sure. Are you familiar?
I'm not familiar with the memo specifically, no.
But are you familiar with the proposal?
If I may, the issue with the Fisheries Act is Environment Canada is responsible for enforcement in freshwater Fisheries Act of deposition of deleterious substances in fish-bearing water. But we are not responsible to do research to investigate if there are potential deleterious substances. We support enforcement and compliance in this area if there is an issue. So if there is an investigation in relation to the Fisheries Act, then we would participate in the investigation.
Right, but I guess my question is, are you aware of this proposal by DFO of putting EC for fully administering and accountable for Section 36 of the Fisheries Act? Are you aware of that?
I'm aware in the broad lines that there's a discussions between DFO and EC, but I'm not part of the discussions at all.
Okay, well, I guess my follow-up question to you would be, I guess from a science perspective, do you think Environment Canada, if this were to occur, has the capacity science-wise to take on Section 36 issues, I guess particularly with respect to science research, if this did go ahead?
Yeah, it's, Environment Canada does have the capacity to do water quality research in support of the Fisheries Act, should there be an enforcement issue.
Right, but I guess I'm asking if they have the capacity if this proposal went ahead from a scientific standpoint.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the specifics of the proposal.
Okay. If we could have that marked as an exhibit, however.
Mr. Commissioner,
984.
I was just going to file another objection. As I understand it, neither of the witnesses are familiar with this document. The lines of questions are valid. However, not being familiar with the document, and I believe it's a document directed toward a briefing note for Deputy Minister Claire Dansero, who's going to be a witness later on in these hearings, I would suggest that perhaps the document and putting the document to evidence would be better served at that time, as neither of these witnesses are familiar with the document.
Perhaps we could have it marked as for identification purposes. I mean, it was put in by the Commission as a listed document.
Letter. It'll be marked as for identification, double B, BB.
Okay, perhaps moving on. Within the PPR, and we're specifically going to pages 56 and 57, and starting at paragraph 128. And this is referring to DFO's 1986 habitat policy. It says a number of water quality roles and responsibilities are assigned to DFO, cooperate with Environment Canada in the establishment of federal priorities for protection of fish and their habitats, cooperate with Environment Canada in the use of powers to control the release of deleterious substances into fish habitats, collaborate, number D, the next page over on page 57 says collaborate with Environment Canada and others to provide advice and specific requirements to control adverse effects. And there's a number of other listings there to work closely with Environment Canada and collaborate with them. My question is for you, Dr. Talbot. As someone working within Environment Canada, how effective would you say that DFO has been in meeting these I guess, priorities or policies in working with Environment Canada in the last 10 years?
I don't think it's a question that I can really answer in terms of DFO's effectiveness. We do not have a formal process with DFO to work in these areas.
So the policy on collaboration, you would say, is a more informal thing then?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, there's more informal collaboration at manager to manager level or scientist to scientist level, and it depends on the issue.
Right. And so would you say that given this policy that's been in existence since 1986, that there perhaps a collaboration and the cooperation on a science to science or manager to manager level could be improved between Environment Canada and DFO?
I guess I would have to say that there's always room for improvement, yeah.
And do you have any specific improvements that you would suggest to the Commissioner?
No, I would not, no.
I think I'll move on to my last set of questions. This goes back to you, Dr. McDonald. This morning you spoke about multiple and contaminants and cumulative impacts as being very difficult and at the heart of the impacts on Fraser River sockeye. Is that correct?
I don't think I specifically said Fraser River sockeye, but it's at the heart of working out how these effects occur for these contaminants to exposed populations and aquatic systems, which include sockeye salmon.
And you also spoke, and it's been mentioned again since you first said it, but you also spoke about the sublethal impacts on endocrine, immune, and olfactory systems from contaminants. And you spoke of them as being every bit as risky as when contaminants cause, I guess, belly upness was the term you used?
Yes.
Okay, and do you agree that contaminant research, perhaps along with genetic research, could provide cutting-edge information about causes of decline of Fraser River sockeye?
I think the answer is absolutely yes. The role of contaminants is not at all clear, and as you've put it, genetic research together with contaminant exposure research would put us a long way towards that.
And so would that be perhaps a recommendation that you would make, is that more funding or a program that would combine those two would be useful for understanding the long-term sustainability of Fraser River sockeye?
Definitely so.
Okay, and that would you agree that without such research, our understanding of the causes of decline of Fraser River sockeye and their long-term sustainability will in fact be limited?
We will be missing something.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions.
Mr. Commissioner, I think Mr. Hopkins-Utter has something he wants to raise with me over the break, otherwise we would have been able to say goodbye to these witnesses, so if I could talk to him over the break, we'll come back, either finish with these people or we'll move to a new panel. Could we come back at, 5 after 3?
Hearing no recess for 10 minutes.